Welcome to Luxurious Tales, where African folktales come alive with depth, mystery, and meaning. Here, every story carries wisdom, every secret has a consequence, and every ending leaves a mark. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. Mireille learned endurance long before she learned hope. She grew up in a quiet coastal town outside Africa, a place defined by routine rather than comfort, where survival was subtle and struggles were rarely spoken aloud. Her mother, Pauline Lawson, was a woman of measured strength, disciplined, soft-spoken, and endlessly practical, who worked long hours and came home each evening with tired eyes but steady hands. Pauline believed in preparation more than promises, and she raised Mireille to understand that life rarely announced its hardships before delivering them. Mireille's father, Julian Lawson, existed more as an idea than a presence. He lived under the same roof for years, yet remained emotionally distant, retreating into silence whenever responsibility demanded vulnerability. His absence was not dramatic, it was quiet and persistent, leaving Mireille with unanswered questions and a growing fear that love, once given, could always be withdrawn without warning. As a child, Mireille adapted by becoming observant. She learned to read the mood of a room the way others read weather forecasts. She noticed the smallest shifts in tone, the tightening of her mother's jaw when bills arrived, the way her father avoided eye contact during difficult conversations. These observations shaped her inner world. She developed habits that grounded her, early morning walks before school, meticulous journaling that helped her process emotions she never voiced aloud, and long hours volunteering at community centers where helping others gave her a sense of control over chaos. Her hobbies were simple but deliberate, structured fitness routines, nature walks, and strategic board games that rewarded patience and foresight. Each activity gave her what her childhood lacked, predictability. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived a quiet anxiety, a fear that attachment was dangerous, that loving deeply meant risking abandonment, just as her mother had done for years without complaint. By the time Mireille reached adulthood, resilience had become second nature. She pursued stability with quiet determination, choosing paths that promised security rather than applause. Friends admired her composure, often mistaking it for emotional detachment, unaware of the constant effort it took to remain balanced. Mireille dreamed not of grand recognition, but of a life where she would never have to beg for consistency or emotional safety. Still, despite her caution, she carried an unspoken hope that somewhere beyond her carefully controlled routines, there existed a version of love that did not disappear when tested. That hope frightened her as much as it sustained her. She did not yet know that endurance, the very skill that had saved her childhood, would one day be tested in ways she could never have imagined, and that the cost of loving the wrong person would be far greater than loneliness. Caleb Whitford grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than truth. His family lived in a polished suburb where trimmed hedges and courteous smiles concealed the quiet competitions happening behind closed doors. His father, Robert Whitford, believed success was earned through dominance and control, a lesson he enforced through relentless expectations rather than warmth. Caleb's mother, Helena Whitford, perfected the art of social grace. She smiled through tension, dismissed discomfort, and taught her son that being admired was safer than being understood. From a young age, Caleb learned that approval was conditional, granted only when he excelled. Failure was never discussed openly, it was something to outgrow, deny, or disguise. Love, in that household, was measured by achievement, not presence. As a boy, Caleb discovered that performance could protect him. He learned how to charm teachers, impress relatives, and outshine peers, crafting a version of himself that earned praise while hiding uncertainty. His friendships were competitive rather than intimate, especially with boys who challenged his status. Winning became his language of self-worth. Even leisure was strategic, sports that rewarded recognition, leadership roles that placed him at the center of attention, social circles that elevated his image. Vulnerability felt dangerous, something that could be used against him. Caleb rarely spoke about fear or doubt. Instead, he refined his ability to deflect, to entertain, to dominate conversations. Over time, this performance hardened into identity. He no longer knew where ambition ended and insecurity began. By adulthood, Caleb had mastered the art of appearing fulfilled. He spoke confidently about the future, about legacy and success, yet his understanding of love remained shallow and transactional. Affection, to him, was affirmation, something given in response to admiration, withdrawn when it no longer served its purpose. He admired strength in others only when it reflected well on him. Deep emotional connection made him uneasy, forcing him to confront parts of himself he preferred to ignore. Though surrounded by people, Caleb was rarely known. He mistook attention for intimacy and control for stability, unaware that the very skills that elevated him socially would later sabotage the one relationship that demanded honesty rather than performance. While Mireille Lawson and Caleb Whitford lived only hours apart, their lives unfolded on parallel tracks that never intersected. Mireille's world expanded quietly through her close-knit circle, anchored by her best friend Sienna Moore, a pragmatic woman with a sharp sense of humor and a protective instinct that bordered on fierce loyalty. Sienna had grown up in a lively household where conflict was loud but resolved quickly, and she often worried that Mireille carried too much weight alone. Their evenings were spent in long conversations, shared meals, and honest debates about boundaries, relationships, and the kind of futures they wanted. Mireille listened more than she spoke, absorbing perspectives while guarding her own heart. To outsiders, her life seemed steady, even uneventful, but beneath the surface she was constantly evaluating, planning, and bracing for change. Caleb's days, by contrast, were filled with motion and noise. His closest companion was Jonah Reed, a longtime friend who had known him since adolescence. Jonah was observant in ways Caleb was not, often noticing the emotional undercurrents Caleb ignored. Though loyal, Jonah carried quiet doubts about the relentless pace of Caleb's ambitions and the emptiness that seemed to follow each achievement. Their friendship revolved around shared history, competitions won, reputations built, risks taken, but rarely ventured into honest self-examination. Caleb preferred it that way. He filled his schedule with commitments and social obligations, rarely allowing silence to linger long enough for reflection. To him, forward momentum was proof of purpose, even when it left him feeling strangely unfulfilled. Elsewhere, Dr. Nathaniel Brooks lived a life defined by responsibility and restraint. A seasoned physician with a reputation for calm precision, Nathaniel balanced long hospital shifts with a private life marked by solitude. He believed deeply in preparation and foresight, values shaped by years of witnessing how quickly circumstances could turn irreversible. Though not yet connected to Mireille or Caleb, his presence in the broader world hinted at intersections yet to come. Around them all, extended family members pursued their own ambitions, friendships formed and dissolved, and small decisions quietly accumulated consequences. None of them knew that these separate paths, so carefully maintained, were slowly converging toward a shared moment that would alter every life involved, exposing truths that performance and endurance alone could no longer conceal. The first time Mireille Lawson and Caleb Whitford crossed paths, it was not marked by romance or instant recognition, but by friction. The setting was ordinary, a structured professional environment where efficiency mattered and time felt compressed, but the encounter itself was anything but forgettable. Mireille noticed Caleb before she heard him, his presence commanding attention without effort. He spoke confidently, assuming space as though it belonged to him by default. When their eyes met, there was no spark, only a brief, unreadable assessment on both sides. Mireille found his confidence excessive, bordering on careless, while Caleb registered her composure as distant, almost dismissive. Neither made an effort to soften their impressions, and the interaction ended abruptly, leaving behind a faint sense of irritation neither could fully explain. Later that day, Caleb replayed the exchange in his mind, unsettled by how little impact his usual charm had made. He was accustomed to being acknowledged, admired, or at least engaged with, yet Mireille had treated him with professional neutrality, neither impressed nor intimidated. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. To restore balance, he dismissed her as guarded, perhaps overly cautious, someone who lacked the boldness he associated with success. Meanwhile, Mireille shared the encounter with Sienna Moore that evening, describing Caleb as someone who seemed more interested in being seen than understood. Sienna laughed it off, teasing Mireille for overanalyzing a stranger, but Mireille couldn't shake the feeling that something about him demanded attention, not because it was appealing, but because it felt unstable. In the days that followed, circumstance forced brief, repeated interactions between them. Each exchange was polite but edged with tension, shaped by misinterpretation and unspoken judgments. Caleb perceived Mireille's restraint as aloofness, while Mireille interpreted his confidence as performative. Neither attempted to bridge the gap, content instead to maintain distance. Yet beneath their mutual reluctance lay a subtle curiosity, the kind born not of attraction but of contradiction. They represented everything the other instinctively avoided, he, a man driven by validation, she, a woman governed by caution. Unaware of it then, this collision of worlds was quietly setting the stage for a connection neither had planned for, one that would grow not from ease, but from challenge and resistance. Trust did not arrive suddenly for Mireille Lawson, it emerged cautiously, shaped by repetition rather than promise. Continued proximity forced her and Caleb Whitford into shared spaces where conversation became unavoidable. At first, their exchanges stayed safely. Surface level, observations about schedules, neutral commentary, brief acknowledgments that avoided personal exposure. Yet over time, circumstances demanded cooperation, and cooperation required communication. Mireille noticed that when Caleb spoke about goals rather than accolades, his voice softened. He listened more than she expected, asking questions that suggested curiosity rather than performance. She remained guarded, offering measured responses, but the sharp edge she once felt around him began to dull. It wasn't trust yet, only a willingness to pause judgment. Caleb, for his part, found himself adjusting in ways that felt unfamiliar. Mireille did not reward bravado or exaggeration, and his usual tactics fell flat. Instead of admiration, she offered clarity. Instead of praise, she asked follow-up questions that forced him to think beyond rehearsed narratives. It unsettled him, yet intrigued him. With Jonah Reed, he mentioned her casually, framing the connection as situational, but Jonah noticed the shift. Caleb seemed more reflective, less reactive. Small moments stood out, shared problem-solving, disagreements resolved without ego, mutual respect built quietly. Still, red flags appeared, Caleb's discomfort with emotional depth, his tendency to redirect conversations when vulnerability approached. Mireille noticed these signs and made mental notes, reminding herself that consistency mattered more than charm. Outside voices weighed in. Sienna Moore urged patience but advised caution, reminding Mireille that effort did not equal reliability. Jonah, observing from the sidelines, wondered whether Caleb was capable of sustaining the authenticity Mireille seemed to demand. As weeks passed, trust formed not through declarations, but through absence of harm, no broken confidences, no sudden withdrawals, no manipulation. For Mireille, this steadiness felt novel, almost dangerous in its calm. For Caleb, it was unfamiliar territory, requiring presence rather than performance. Neither recognized it yet, but the foundation they were laying was uneven, built on different expectations of what trust meant, and how easily it could be undone. When affection finally emerged between Mireille Lawson and Caleb Whitford, it did not announce itself with certainty. It arrived quietly, layered over routine and familiarity, mistaken at first for comfort. Caleb was the one who named it, confident in his declaration, framing their connection as inevitable rather than evolving. Mireille received his words carefully, weighing them against her observations. She felt drawn to the steadiness that had replaced his earlier bravado, to the moments when he seemed present rather than performative. Yet even in love's early stages, the imbalance was subtle but real. Mireille invested emotionally, listening deeply, remembering details, adjusting her expectations to meet him halfway. Caleb, meanwhile, enjoyed the affirmation her attention brought, mistaking devotion for compatibility. Family reactions exposed the divide further. Mireille's mother, Pauline Lawson, welcomed Caleb politely but watched closely, noting how often conversations revolved around his ambitions and rarely around mutual growth. Sienna Moore voiced her concerns more directly, pointing out that Mireille often compromised while Caleb rarely adjusted. Caleb's parents viewed the relationship through a different lens. Helena Whitford admired Mireille's composure, seeing her as an asset, someone who complemented Caleb's image. Robert Whitford approved quietly, satisfied that his son appeared settled. Caleb absorbed this approval easily, interpreting it as confirmation that he had chosen well, without questioning whether he was offering the same consideration in return. Privately, cracks appeared in small moments. Caleb deflected serious discussions about long-term emotional needs, preferring to focus on milestones and appearances. Mireille noticed how disagreements ended when she yielded, how peace was often restored at her expense. Still, she believed effort could bridge gaps, that consistency might inspire reciprocity. Caleb, secure in her affection, felt no urgency to examine his own shortcomings. Love, to him, was something earned through success and maintained through admiration. To Mireille, it was an active commitment, requiring vulnerability and care. Neither articulated these differences aloud. Instead, they moved forward, each convinced, incorrectly, that they were building the same future, unaware that imbalance, once normalized, rarely corrects itself without consequence. The wedding arrived with efficiency rather than celebration, organized to satisfy expectations instead of honoring readiness. Mireille Lawson approached the day with quiet resolve, treating it as a commitment to consistency rather than a culmination of romance. She focused on details that mattered to her: timing, logistics, the comfort of guests, while pushing aside lingering doubts that surfaced whenever she imagined the years ahead. Caleb Whitford stood beside her with visible confidence, greeting well-wishers and managing impressions with ease. To him, the ceremony signaled arrival, a visible marker of stability that complemented his trajectory. There was affection between them, but it was measured, restrained by the unspoken understanding that marriage would refine what already existed rather than challenge it. Early into married life, differences that had once seemed manageable became structural. Decisions defaulted to Caleb's preferences, often framed as practical or efficient. Mireille found herself adjusting schedules, expectations, and even tone to maintain harmony. When she raised concerns, Caleb reassured her quickly, promising alignment without revisiting the issue. Helena Whitford visited often, offering advice that sounded supportive but subtly reinforced hierarchy, suggestions about appearances, routines, and priorities that placed Caleb's comfort at the center. Robert Whitford remained distant yet approving, satisfied that his son had chosen a partner who did not disrupt momentum. Mireille absorbed these dynamics quietly, interpreting accommodation as partnership, even as her own needs receded. Moments of intimacy existed, but they were fragile, easily disrupted by miscommunication. Caleb avoided prolonged discussions about emotional labor, preferring to resolve tension with gestures rather than reflection. Mireille, accustomed to endurance, rationalized the imbalance as an adjustment period. She believed preparation could be learned, that shared life would teach them what premarital conversations had not. Yet beneath the routines of cohabitation lay a growing sense of disquiet. Marriage had formalized patterns that were once negotiable, and the space for recalibration narrowed with each compromise. Neither recognized the warning signs fully. They were building a life without tools for repair, mistaking absence of conflict for compatibility, and stability for safety. The house they moved into was spacious and orderly, chosen for convenience and proximity rather than warmth. At first, Mireille Lawson approached it as a project, organizing routines, establishing rhythms, making space for calm. She woke early, maintained structured days, and ensured that meals and schedules aligned smoothly. On the surface, the home functioned well. Beneath it, however, Mireille sensed a quiet unease. Caleb Whitford was often present but not engaged, physically occupying rooms while remaining emotionally elsewhere. Conversations revolved around logistics and outcomes, rarely drifting towards shared reflection. Mireille began to notice how often silence filled the space between them, not as peace, but as avoidance. The house felt efficient, not nurturing, and she could not explain why that distinction unsettled her so deeply. Caleb experienced the home differently. To him, it represented progress, evidence that his life was aligning as planned. He expected comfort without having to ask for it, order without having to maintain it. When tension surfaced, he dismissed it as temporary stress, confident that stability would settle everything. New acquaintances entered their orbit, neighbors, extended relatives, and colleagues, each interaction reinforcing his sense of accomplishment. Mireille observed how easily Caleb performed ease in public, how warmly he spoke when others were present, and how quickly that warmth cooled in private. She did not accuse him, only noted the pattern. Each instance added to her growing awareness that safety was not guaranteed by walls or vows. Sienna Moore visited often, sensing the shift before Mireille named it. She noticed how Mireille's voice softened around Caleb, how decisions were framed as mutual while consistently favoring one direction. Sienna asked careful questions, encouraging honesty without pressure. Mireille admitted feeling unsettled, though she struggled to articulate why. She had endured worse, she reasoned. This was not hardship, only imbalance. Yet endurance had taught her something important. Environments that required constant adjustment eventually demanded a cost. The home, though outwardly stable, had become a place where Mireille monitored herself more than she rested. Without realizing it, she was learning that emotional safety is not absence of chaos, but presence of care, and this house was beginning to feel like a space where care was conditional. The confirmation arrived quietly, without ceremony, on a morning Mireille Lawson had expected to be ordinary. She sat alone for a long time, absorbing the reality with measured breaths, feeling a mix of wonder and apprehension settle into her chest. Pregnancy, to her, represented both continuity and vulnerability. It awakened memories of her mother's sacrifices and fears she had buried since childhood, of being needed and then left. When she told Caleb Whitford, she chose her words carefully, hoping to read his response as much as hear it. He listened, nodded, and embraced her with controlled calm. His reaction was composed, almost rehearsed, lacking the spontaneous warmth she had imagined but offering reassurance nonetheless. Mireille accepted it, telling herself that people express joy differently. As news spread, reactions varied. Pauline Lawson responded with quiet relief and practical questions, already thinking ahead to support and preparation. Sienna Moore was openly emotional, reminding Mireille that this was a moment to be protected, not managed. On Caleb's side, Helena Whitford focused on timing and appearances, offering advice that framed the pregnancy as an extension of family legacy. Robert Whitford expressed approval with a brief congratulatory call, satisfied that the next milestone had been reached. Amid these voices, Mireille noticed how often conversations centered on outcomes rather than experience, on what the child would represent, rather than how she was feeling. Caleb remained attentive in public, discussing plans confidently, but in private he grew quieter, as though the responsibility had introduced a weight he had not anticipated. As weeks passed, subtle shifts emerged. Mireille became more reflective, protective of her emotional state, listening closely to her body and instincts. She hoped the pregnancy might draw Caleb inward, invite a deeper connection. Instead, she sensed him becoming more controlled, more measured in his affection. He reassured her when asked, dismissing concerns as hormonal or temporary. Mireille wanted to believe him, yet something felt unresolved. The pregnancy was already changing her priorities, sharpening her awareness of what safety truly meant. Unspoken questions lingered. Would this new life strengthen what was fragile, or expose it? She could not know then that this moment, so quietly transformative, was setting in motion forces that would test not only her endurance, but her survival. The changes in Caleb Whitford did not arrive with cruelty or confrontation. They crept in quietly, disguised as stress and responsibility. Mireille Lawson noticed it first in the small things, his impatience when plans shifted, the way he sighed when she asked questions, the subtle withdrawal that followed moments requiring emotional reassurance. He began correcting her more often, framing it as efficiency, reminding her of priorities that increasingly centered around his comfort and timelines. When Mireille expressed discomfort, Caleb reassured her quickly, but his reassurance felt procedural rather than heartfelt. He spoke of the future with certainty, yet avoided conversations about emotional needs in the present. Mireille told herself it was temporary, that pressure changed people, but the unease lingered. Physically, the pregnancy demanded adjustments, and Mireille navigated them with care, determined not to let vulnerability define her. She maintained her routines, adapted her habits, and leaned on Sienna more frequently. Sienna noticed the strain immediately, the way Mireille hesitated before speaking, the way she softened truths to avoid conflict. She warned gently that emotional neglect often precedes deeper harm, but Mireille resisted that interpretation. She believed in patience, in communication, in effort. Caleb, meanwhile, grew more controlling under the guise of concern. He questioned her choices, monitored her schedule, and dismissed her instincts as overcautious. Each interaction chipped away at her confidence, though the damage was subtle enough to be rationalized away. Friends and family sensed the shift without fully understanding it. Jonah Reed observed Caleb's growing irritability and questioned whether pressure was revealing something deeper. Pauline Lawson urged rest and emotional protection, reminding Mireille that pregnancy amplified truths rather than creating them. Mireille listened, but hope remained stubborn. She wanted to believe that stability would return, that love could recalibrate itself. Yet beneath that hope lay a growing realization she was not ready to face. The change was not sudden, but cumulative. Something essential was eroding, quietly and persistently, and she could feel herself standing at the edge of a truth that, once acknowledged, would be impossible to ignore. By the time Mireille Lawson reached the later months of her pregnancy, the tension in the household had shifted from invisible to undeniable. Financial discussions, once neutral, became charged with control. Caleb Whitford scrutinized expenses with a sharpness that felt less about responsibility and more about authority, questioning decisions Mireille had always managed competently. He framed his concerns as protection, yet his tone suggested distrust. Mireille, already navigating physical changes and emotional fatigue, felt the weight of constant justification. Each conversation ended with an uneasy truce rather than resolution, leaving her feeling smaller, more cautious. The cracks in their relationship were no longer theoretical, they had shape, sound, and consequence, echoing through daily routines that now felt strained and brittle. For the first time, Mireille pushed back. It was not dramatic or loud, but firm. She expressed how the scrutiny made her feel unsupported, how decisions framed as mutual rarely were. Her words were measured, chosen carefully to avoid escalation, yet Caleb reacted sharply. He interpreted her boundaries as challenge, her clarity as ingratitude. His resentment surfaced in clipped responses and cold silences that lasted hours. Mireille was startled not by disagreement, but by the speed with which empathy disappeared. She realized then how much peace had depended on her compliance. Standing up for herself felt necessary, but it also exposed how fragile their equilibrium truly was. Outside the home, concern grew. Sienna Moore noticed the emotional toll etched into Mireille's posture and urged her to prioritize safety over harmony. Pauline Lawson reminded her that love should not feel like negotiation under pressure. Even Jonah Reed, observing Caleb's agitation from a distance, questioned whether his friend was losing perspective. Caleb, however, retreated further into defensiveness, convinced that control equaled order. The household became a place of careful steps and unspoken rules. Mireille sensed that something fundamental had shifted, that this was no longer a phase to be endured, but a fault line widening beneath them. The cracks, once subtle, were now impossible to hide, and the strain of holding everything together was becoming unsustainable. The argument began over something insignificant, the kind of detail that once would have passed without notice. A scheduling conflict, a missed call, a misunderstanding about timing, none of it should have mattered. Yet by the time voices were raised, Mireille Lawson realized the disagreement was never about that moment at all. It was about months of swallowed words, about decisions made unilaterally and justified afterward, about a growing sense of erasure she could no longer ignore. She spoke carefully at first, explaining how unheard she felt, how pregnancy had made her more aware of what she needed rather than less. Caleb Whitford listened with visible impatience, his posture rigid, his responses clipped. Each time she tried to clarify, he interrupted, reframing her concerns as accusations rather than pleas for understanding. As the conversation stretched on, exhaustion replaced caution. Caleb's tone sharpened, his words becoming defensive and absolute. He accused Mireille of overreacting, of creating problems where none existed, of failing to appreciate the stability he believed he provided. Mireille countered with specifics, missed support, dismissed feelings, moments where she had felt alone despite being married. The exchange grew circular, neither yielding ground, both convinced they were unheard. What unsettled Mireille most was not the disagreement itself, but Caleb's refusal to acknowledge impact. He spoke of intention, of effort, of outcomes, but never of empathy. The argument revealed a fundamental difference. Mireille sought repair, while Caleb sought control. Though no physical harm occurred, the emotional distance between them widened with every word. When silence finally fell, it was heavy and unresolved. Caleb withdrew, retreating into isolation as a form of punishment, while Mireille remained seated, hands resting protectively against her body, breathing through the aftershocks. She felt a deep, unfamiliar fear, not of confrontation, but of what it had exposed. This was not a disagreement that could be smoothed over with time. It had revealed fault lines too deep to ignore. Foreshadowing lingered in the stillness, an unspoken awareness that something irreversible had been set in motion. Mireille sensed it intuitively. The next rupture would not be confined to words alone, and the cost of unresolved anger was moving steadily toward a point of no return. The confrontation unfolded on a quiet afternoon that felt deceptively ordinary. Mireille Lawson had asked for space, time to cool down, to revisit the unresolved argument with clearer heads. Caleb Whitford interpreted the request as defiance. His frustration, long contained behind measured words, surfaced in sharp movements and an unsteady tone. As Mireille turned away to end the exchange, Caleb stepped forward, insisting she listen. The moment escalated not through intent but through impulse. His hand made contact with her arm, pushing her backward as he emphasized his point. It was not forceful by design, yet it was careless enough to matter. Mireille lost her balance, stumbling and falling hard against the floor. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs and replaced it with a sudden, alarming pain that radiated through her body. What followed was immediate confusion. Mireille struggled to steady herself, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. She felt a tightening sensation she could not ignore, a wave of dizziness that blurred the edges of the room. Caleb froze, shock overtaking anger as he realized the severity of what had happened. His first response was disbelief, then panic. He spoke rapidly, insisting she was fine, urging her to stand, as though minimizing the moment could undo it. Mireille could not respond. Fear set in, deep and primal, centered not on herself alone but on the life she was carrying. The silence between them fractured as the situation shifted from argument to emergency. Help arrived quickly, summoned by neighbors who heard the commotion and recognized distress. As paramedics assessed Mireille, their urgency confirmed what she already felt, that this was no minor incident. Caleb watched from a distance, his expression caught between alarm and detachment, struggling to process the consequences of his actions. Mireille was guided carefully onto a stretcher, her thoughts fragmented by pain and dread. In that moment, everything she had endured crystallized into clarity. This was not a misunderstanding or a phase. It was the result of months of imbalance, unchecked control, and unresolved anger. As she was taken away, Mireille understood with chilling certainty that the push had altered more than her physical state, it had irrevocably changed the course of their lives. The hospital corridor was a narrow tunnel of fluorescent light and urgent movement, where time fractured into sharp, indistinct moments. Mireille Lawson was rushed through swinging doors, her awareness slipping in and out as voices overlapped, measured, professional, unyielding. She clung to fragments, instructions spoken quickly, the pressure of hands guiding her, the cold reassurance of practiced calm. Pain surged and receded in waves that demanded all her focus. In that liminal space between fear and hope, Mireille searched for something steady to anchor her, familiar voices, reassurance, anything that suggested she was not alone. She felt the weight of uncertainty press down on her chest, heavier than the physical discomfort, as the gravity of the situation became impossible to deny. Caleb Whitford arrived moments later, breathless and pale, his composure unraveling under the sterile intensity of the emergency room. When the attending physician paused to explain the risks, Caleb's response cut through the noise with startling clarity. "Just rescue my child," he said, his voice strained but resolute. "I don't care about her." The words hung in the air, stark and irreversible. Mireille heard them, clearer than any instruction or alarm. They landed not as confusion or panic, but as a verdict. In that instant, something inside her closed, a quiet finality settling over her thoughts. The fear she had felt transformed, sharpening into a cold awareness that the person she trusted to protect her had chosen a different priority without hesitation. The medical team moved swiftly, urgency eclipsing emotion. Questions were asked, decisions made, protocols initiated. Mireille's consciousness wavered, but the sentence replayed relentlessly, echoing louder than the monitors around her. Family members arrived in fragments, Pauline Lawson's face tight with worry, Sienna Moore's hands clenched together in silent prayer, each absorbing the tension in different ways. Dr. Nathaniel Brooks stepped in, his demeanor steady, eyes assessing both the patient and the stakes. He spoke calmly, outlining next steps with precision, committing to the hardest possible task. As Mireille was prepared for surgery, she carried with her the weight of that moment, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would redefine her understanding of love, safety, and survival forever. Time lost its familiar shape inside the operating suite, stretching into something unrecognizable. Mireille Lawson lay suspended between consciousness and darkness as preparations intensified around her. Dr. Nathaniel Brooks moved with deliberate precision, issuing calm directives that steadied the room. Every motion carried consequence, every decision demanded foresight. The situation was severe but not hopeless, a narrow margin that required absolute focus. Outside the sterile field, alarms chimed in controlled intervals, each sound a reminder that outcomes were not guaranteed. Mireille's body responded unevenly, forcing the team to adapt in real time. The air was heavy with concentration, not panic, a testament to the discipline of those tasked with preserving 2 lives under extraordinary pressure. In the waiting area, the atmosphere fractured. Pauline Lawson sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the closed doors as though will alone could influence the outcome. Sienna Moore paced silently, anger and fear colliding beneath her restraint. Jonah Reed arrived later, drawn by fragmented messages and unease, his concern deepening as he observed Caleb Whitford's detached pacing. Caleb spoke little, offering short responses when questioned, his focus narrowed to outcomes rather than process. The contrast was unmistakable. Where others expressed vulnerability, he displayed calculation. The strain revealed fault lines in relationships that had long gone unexamined, and judgment passed quietly among those who witnessed it. Hours passed without update. Dr. Burks remained inside, adjusting strategy as complications arose, refusing to surrender to momentum or assumption. The surgery demanded patience and adaptability, testing every ounce of his experience. When progress finally stabilized, it did so incrementally, without celebration. The effort was relentless, exhausting, and exacting. For Mireille, the world existed only in fragments, sensations without context, voices without faces. Yet beneath it all, a fragile persistence endured, a quiet insistence on survival that mirrored her life's pattern. When the doors finally opened, no one rushed forward. The moment demanded stillness, respect for the gravity of what had just transpired, and the lives irrevocably altered by it. When Mireille Lawson regained full awareness, it was not with relief but with a profound, aching stillness. The room was dim and quiet, the kind of quiet that followed catastrophe rather than calm. Dr. Nathaniel Burks stood nearby, his expression composed yet careful, as though each word required precision. He explained what had been done, what had been saved, and what would take time to heal. Mireille listened without interruption, absorbing the information with a distant clarity. Then he told her about her daughter. A baby girl. Alive. Strong enough to breathe on her own after extraordinary intervention. Mireille felt tears gather, not from joy alone, but from the sheer cost of survival. The name came to her without hesitation, Ivy, a symbol of persistence, growth against odds, and quiet strength. When Mireille was finally allowed to see her child, the moment unfolded slowly, reverently. Ivy was small, wrapped carefully, her presence both fragile and powerful. Mireille's hands trembled as she reached out, her body still weak, her emotions raw. Holding Ivy stirred something primal and grounding, a sense of purpose that cut through pain and exhaustion. Yet even in that intimate moment, grief lingered. The memory of the hospital corridor, the words she had heard, cast a shadow she could not ignore. Caleb Whitford did not enter the room immediately. When he eventually did, his presence felt distant, restrained by discomfort rather than concern. He looked at the child, nodded once, and spoke about logistics, arrangements, next steps, avoiding Mireille's gaze entirely. In the days that followed, Mireille began to understand the depth of what had changed. Physical recovery was slow and demanding, but emotional recovery felt far more complex. Caleb's absence became routine rather than exception. He visited briefly, spoke sparingly, and left without reassurance. Nurses noticed. Sienna Moore noticed. Pauline Lawson noticed. Mireille noticed most of all. She felt emotionally abandoned in the very moment she was most vulnerable. Yet as Ivy stirred beside her, breathing steadily, Mireille felt something else take root, resolve. She would endure, as she always had, but not blindly. Ivy's life marked a boundary, a point beyond which sacrifice without reciprocity would no longer be justified. Something had ended, quietly and finally, and something else, unfamiliar but fierce, had begun. The truth did not arrive all at once, it emerged through fragments that refused to align with the story Mireille Lawson had been told. It began with a routine administrative review, documents requested for extended recovery support and custody planning, where discrepancies surfaced quietly. Names of assets appeared that Mireille did not recognize, accounts that predated their marriage yet were referenced as shared outcomes. Dr. Nathaniel Burks, careful not to overstep, suggested she consult an independent advisor to understand her options. Sienna Moore, alarmed by the inconsistencies, helped gather records Caleb had managed alone. As the pieces accumulated, a different narrative took shape, one that revealed deliberate omissions, strategic silence, and a pattern of control masked as responsibility. What Mireille uncovered reframed everything. Caleb Whitford had long benefited from a private trust established through extended family channels, structured to reward appearances of stability and lineage continuity. The marriage had not been a partnership in the way she believed. It had functioned, in part, as proof of compliance required to access expanded benefits. More disturbing was evidence that Caleb had shielded liabilities, decisions that transferred risk without transparency, while presenting himself publicly as prudent and dependable. Jonah Reed, confronted gently, admitted he had suspected something but never imagined the depth of it. The revelation was not a single betrayal, but a system of choices that placed outcomes above people. Mireille realized with a chilling calm that the hospital words were not spoken in panic, they were consistent with a long-held hierarchy. The final fracture came when Mireille learned that safeguards had been drafted without her knowledge, contingencies that prioritized control in the event of incapacity. The intent was unmistakable. She felt grief, not only for the marriage she thought she had, but for the future she had tried to build within it. Yet the truth also brought clarity. The fog lifted. What had felt like confusion now had shape and cause. Mireille did not rage or confront immediately. Endurance had taught her the value of timing. With Ivy sleeping beside her and a trusted circle forming around her, she chose strategy over spectacle. The hidden truth, once uncovered, did not weaken her, it oriented her. And from that orientation, consequences would follow with precision rather than fury. The unraveling of Caleb Whitford's carefully managed world began quietly, the way structural failures often do, without spectacle, but with inevitability. The safeguards he had relied upon assumed compliance and silence, neither of which remained intact. Independent reviews triggered by administrative inconsistencies expanded into formal scrutiny, drawing attention to decisions long shielded by discretion. What Caleb had framed as prudent management was reclassified as calculated risk displacement. Professional relationships cooled rapidly as questions multiplied. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. The same circles that once amplified his confidence now treated him with cautious distance. Caleb felt the shift immediately, though he struggled to identify its source. Control, the tool he trusted most, no longer produced certainty. Social consequences followed with sharper edges. Helena Whitford's influence softened under external pressure, her practiced composure strained by inquiries she could not deflect. Robert Whitford, long silent, expressed disappointment without defense, prioritizing reputation over rescue. Jonah Reed withdrew, recognizing too late the cost of complicity through inaction. Friends who once celebrated Caleb's milestones avoided alignment, unwilling to inherit fallout. Alone with diminishing leverage, Caleb grew restless and defensive, insisting the situation was temporary, that systems would correct themselves. Yet each attempt to reassert dominance only confirmed what others now saw clearly, that his authority had relied on concealment rather than trust. The loss was not sudden, but cumulative, stripping away layers until little remained beneath performance. Mireille Lawson observed the collapse from a distance, neither orchestrating nor obstructing it. Her focus remained on recovery and Ivy's steady growth, supported by a network grounded in transparency rather than image. When Caleb reached out, first cautiously, then with urgency, she responded with clarity and restraint. There was no confrontation, no dramatics. Only boundaries. Karma did not arrive as punishment, but as consequence, precise and proportionate. Caleb's world did not end, it recalibrated without him at the center. And in that recalibration, Mireille reclaimed something far more enduring than vindication, autonomy, stability, and the quiet power of having chosen truth when silence would have been easier. Mireille Lawson's recovery unfolded without announcement, shaped by intention rather than reaction. Days found rhythm again, measured mornings, careful planning, and long, quiet hours learning Ivy's cues. She prioritized stability, consistent care, predictable routines, and decisions rooted in transparency. Support came from those who had earned trust, Pauline Lawson's steady presence, Sienna Moore's practical vigilance, and professionals who explained options without coercion. Mireille documented everything, not from fear, but from clarity. The past no longer dictated her next steps, it informed them. In choosing structure over spectacle, she rebuilt from the inside out, strengthening systems that protected both her body and her future. Caleb Whitford's attempts to reconnect followed a familiar pattern, apologies framed by urgency, assurances offered without accountability. He spoke of misunderstanding and pressure, of intentions gone awry. Mireille listened once, then set boundaries with calm precision. She did not debate history or negotiate responsibility. The conversation ended where it needed to, with limits clearly stated and enforced. This refusal to engage theatrics unsettled Caleb more than anger would have. He realized too late that the audience he depended on was gone. Jonah Reed, witnessing the exchange from afar, understood the difference between remorse and consequence. Mireille had moved beyond the need for validation. She was choosing sustainability. As Ivy grew stronger, Mireille's confidence settled into something unshakable. She made decisions that reflected her values, prioritizing health, security, and presence over appearances. The home she built now felt safe because it was honest. Friends expanded the circle, routines deepened, and trust was earned slowly, deliberately. Choosing herself was not an act of defiance, it was an alignment. She no longer endured for the sake of harmony. She created it. And in that choice, she secured a future defined not by what she survived, but by what she protected. New beginnings did not arrive for Mireille Lawson with applause or dramatic declarations. They came quietly, carried by consistency and intention. Her days were no longer shaped by vigilance or compromise, but by deliberate choices that honored her well-being and Ivy's future. Mornings began with structure and calm, evenings closed with reflection rather than exhaustion. The home she created felt fundamentally different from the one she had left behind, not because it was larger or grander, but because it was safe. Trust lived there, not as an assumption, but as a practice reinforced daily. Mireille no longer measured success by endurance, she measured it by peace. Ivy thrived within that environment, her presence a constant reminder of resilience born from adversity. Watching her daughter grow anchored Mireille in the present while offering hope unburdened by the past. Relationships deepened organically, Pauline Lawson's quiet wisdom guiding without control, Sienna Moore's loyalty steady and unyielding, and a wider community formed through honesty rather than obligation. Dr. Nathaniel Brooks remained a distant but meaningful figure, a symbol of integrity during the most uncertain hours. Mireille did not rewrite her history or deny her pain. She contextualized it, placing it where it belonged, behind her, informative but no longer defining. Caleb Whitford's chapter closed without reconciliation or redemption. His world continued on a smaller scale, reshaped by consequences he could neither deflect nor reframe. Mireille wished him no harm, but offered no access. The separation was final, not out of bitterness, but clarity. As she stood one evening watching Ivy sleep, Mireille understood that survival had been only the beginning. What followed, this life of autonomy, care, and truth, was the real triumph. Endurance had brought her here, but choice would carry her forward. And in that choice, she stepped fully into a future defined by strength, stability, and the unwavering promise of new beginnings. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales, where every story carries meaning and every lesson echoes beyond the ending. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, remember, every tale has a lesson, and every ending is only the beginning.